Welcome. This is another in a series of Interpreter Foundation Roundtables. Our topic today is Old Testament Gospel Doctrine, Lesson 30, the title of which is Come to the House of the Lord. The actual scriptures that it covers is 2 Chronicles chapters 29 through 35. And the purpose of the lesson, lest we forget it, is to inspire temple attendance and scripture study. With me today on our roundtable are BYU professor Shon Hopkin and Bruce Webster. My name's Martin Tanner. To start us off today, we thought we would just give a little bit of background about 2 Chronicles and the context of the story here. And as we were discussing before this roundtable started, if we did a poll of 50 or 100 or 1,000 Latter-day Saints or Christians or Jews and said, raise your hand if your favorite book of Scripture is 2 Chronicles, you would probably have 0 hands go up. So we're going to try to make this book that is not probably anyone's favorite to somewhat exciting, because there's some really fascinating information here. And the point of the lesson deals with the temple, which ought to be something of use and value for of course, everyone. If you talk about the reign of the leaders of Israel and start off with King David and go through the other kings and in one case a queen, you get to the point of our lesson here from King David, who appears approximately 1000 BC, to Hezekiah, whose reign was from about 715 BC to about 687. And Hezekiah is an interesting young king. He started to rule at the age of 29. And so picture a 29-year-old doing the things that are described in this story, like refurbishing and reconsecrating the temple. Someone who has enough wherewithal to figure out how to call upon God and to reject aggression from Syria, and someone who has the smarts to do things also described in here, like fortify the city, take away water sources from outside and make it so that it's usable within Jerusalem, to overcome sieges that he would see in his reign as a king. This is a fascinating time period. It also covers other kings besides Hezekiah, and the other one that we focus a great deal on is excuse me, Josiah, who was the king from about 640 to 609 BC. You'll note that at the end of his reign in about 609 BC, we're within a decade or so of the time that Lehi leaves Jerusalem. So at the end of our lesson here, we are within just a few years of the Book of Mormon narrative time. And so there is some fascinating information to go over here. And before we jump into the actual lesson itself, which starts in chapter 29, let's turn the time over to Shon to tell us a little bit more about the background and context of these fascinating parts of the Bible that are often overlooked.
All right, so one of the things I wanted to cover, and this isn't necessarily something that you would cover in Gospel Doctrine class, but I think would be a good thing for you to be aware of, is a certain biblical scholarly view that really comes into play importantly right in this part of the text, and that's called the documentary hypothesis. I know some of you are going to want to go to sleep when I use some of these words, but stick with me. That's many biblical scholars have said, boy, it's pretty clear there are a lot of different editing strands, editors who have touched this storyline over time, and that seems to be the case. And really, as Latter-day Saints, our doctrine leads us to not be threatened by those kinds of things, right? We believe the Bible has gone through multiple hands and has at times suffered, the story has been altered and changed for those hands. Even with the Book of Mormon, which we see as the most correct book of any book on earth, it had its editors, and they were structuring the story in certain ways to teach lessons. Well, so 4 of the strands that have been proposed, 4 different sort of story, people telling the story, and then it was all tied together later on, and this is just a proposal. It isn't necessarily the way you need to see this. Some biblical scholars would agree and some would disagree. One is called J, or the Yahwist strand, and the idea is that there was a writer in the southern kingdom of Judah, and you can identify that writer's ideology because he sort of focuses on the name of Yahweh prevalently early on, and there's a lot of it he focuses on the southern kingdom. A slightly later strand, some would say, is the E strand, the Elohist, that focuses on the name of Elohim and says, no, the name of Yahweh doesn't show up until later on. Seems to be maybe a northern kingdom author. Then those are combined at some point. Now, where this actually ties into what we're talking about today, the 2 later strands potentially are called P, the priestly strand, and D, the Deuteronomistic or Deuteronomic strand. And some scholars believe P happened at the time of Hezekiah when he's making all these reforms that possibly some of the temple priests at this point or maybe later go back and edit through, and they may even be the ones that write 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that to focus on the temple, to focus on the importance of that temple service, to make sure everybody is focused there. As Latter-day Saints, we'd say, well, are these people inspired? Are they not? First of all, was there even the strand that existed? But then an even maybe more important strand for us comes under the time of Josiah that Martin has mentioned, and that's the Deuteronomic strand. Some biblical scholars, if you remember, they find a book of the law and they say, whoa, what is this book of the law? Let's read it. And they're like, well, what is this thing? And we're reading this thinking, what? Haven't you been reading this the whole time? What could this be? And some biblical scholars at this point, sort of the light bulb goes on and they say, what could this thing be? Have they actually written now for the first time the book of Deuteronomy, and they're introducing it as a lost book, and then they're going through and editing the Bible to sort of fit sort of a Deuteronomic viewpoint? Well, there are some reasons that this actual viewpoint that sort of fits in here maybe with the time of Josiah has been attractive to Latter-day Saints. Some of the things that they believe the Deuteronomistic history may have edited out, and there are non-Christian biblical scholars who have seen this way, some believe in earlier Israelite history and early biblical history there was a very clear view of the Father God, El or Elohim, and the Son God, Yahweh, and it was very clear. And the Deuteronomist said, oh boy, that's starting to sound too much like these other religions with pantheons. We got to combine those into one God, and so you start to lose the feel for a clear Son of God. You can't have this sort of divine pantheon of God the Father and God the Son and others that are important, so let's sort of eliminate those strands. And you can't have all these different temples. Let's say, no, there's only one temple in Jerusalem, and it's all got to come there. And that seems to maybe fit some of the things Josiah was trying to accomplish. And also maybe explain to us as Latter-day Saints why, when we read in the Bible, are the hints of Christ so muted? Why is the teachings of the Son of God, why does it read so differently than the Pearl of Great Price? This could be a very compelling explanation that others have seen, not just Latter-day Saints. Now, there are some problems with that view as well. What does that say about who actually wrote the books of Moses? Because the Book of Mormon seems pretty clear for most that Moses was the author of those first 5 books, and this would say, no, Deuteronomy is being created later. So, I've got some friends who would say, well, Moses wrote it, but then it was heavily edited, etc., etc. I know I've put many of you to sleep. I just the reason I thought I should take some time on this is first to say there's a lot of history with this Bible. And as Bruce said before, I thought he said very well right before we got online, he said, you know, sometimes I feel like, boy, I've got to take a stand and die with some of these biblical stories. And as Latter-day Saints, we love these biblical stories. They're important. Gospel principles and doctrines, I think, are what we take our stand with, right? That they're God the Father and His Son Jesus Christ. God is our Father and Christ is the Savior. That prophets are real, that these prophets did exist historically and spoke with God and had priesthood authority, yes. But this book has been through lots of hands, and that makes it, sometimes we like all the answers to be clear, and so we can just sort of cross that off and say, oh, I understand it all now, I don't have to think about it anymore. The Bible is much more exciting than that. You're constantly having to engage with the text and say, what might be going on here? Who is telling the story here? I don't know if you've noticed as you're reading 2 Chronicles, who is telling the story? We don't really know who the editor is. Book of Mormon, it's Mormon. Here, who is this? We're not sure. Now, I love the biblical account. I'm inspired by it. And part of the reason I love it is because I have to deeply engage with it, and I have to bring my spirit to bear and pray for the Spirit so that I can sort some of these things out and try to understand what's going on. Okay, was that way too much, Martin and Bruce? I apologize.
No, I think that was excellent. And the only thing I would add to that, I love the Old Testament. And in fact, when I give lessons and give talks, when possible, I always like to start with a passage from the Old Testament, just because I don't think we quote from it often enough. But as you said, and you know, as you were quoting me, it's something you have to engage with. I love it for its antiquity. I mean, because of the fact it's been through so many hands and been through so much, it becomes a challenge to tease out of the Old Testament what the underlying eternal principles are, and what the lessons are in these stories. When I was teaching Old Testament Gospel Doctrine 8 years ago, almost every class, I mean, I'm sure there are classes where I didn't, but in class after class, I would say, for those of you who have been to the temple, look at this language, look at this concept. The Old Testament is pervaded by temple concepts, temple language. And that's actually true in a lot of what we've got in today's lesson as well. So I'll stop there and
thank you, Bruce. Martin, let me just say one last thing in connection with that. So as Latter-day Saints, we should not be embarrassed by our approach that we come at this through the lens of modern-day revelation and the Pearl of Great Price and other things. This really helps us understand what may have been going on, because it's very difficult sometimes to know. And so I think we should be loyal to the Pearl of Great Price account, Moses and Abraham, and deeply loyal to what we see in the Doctrine and Covenants, because there's so much that's unknown. Having modern-day revelation really helps us structure our view of what's going on. It's a huge blessing to know that those doctrines were taught, because there are a lot of non-LDS scholars who'd say there's lots missing that used to be here. And interestingly enough, some of the things they claim are missing are things that are very dear to us as Latter-day Saints. And just one last thing. I know, again, some of you are thinking, why are we talking about this? The tie-in to this section of Scripture, again, is that those strong reforms that Hezekiah made and that Josiah made, some of the biblical scholars have said, oh, that's maybe the place where a strong editing happened, where they're trying to avoid apostasy and say, let's sort of center in on things, and maybe some things were lost at that point. There's just a chance of that. Okay, I'm done.
Perfect. This whole idea of editing and books that you've both brought up is wonderful. If somebody takes a look at the Book of Mormon or a flow chart about all the plates, you see a similar thing going on, even just during the time frame of the Book of Mormon narrative. Different people edit plates, they extract what's most important and what's useful, and that's what's going on in the Old Testament here. And the idea that it's gone through many different hands is something that happened with the Book of Mormon as well. So this is a concept that should be very, very familiar to us, and something that we understand and embrace, perhaps more than other people who haven't taken a look at the Book of Mormon. So there's a close tie there. Also, one of the other key things to think about here in connection with our modern religious practice, what we do today as Latter-day Saints, is this whole idea of a temple, and that's where the actual storyline starts out in 2 Chronicles chapter 29. Although we should not somehow mistake what's going on in 2 Chronicles 29 and the purification and rededication of the temple under the reign of Hezekiah as something even close to the kind of temple worship that we have now. I mean, there's not a single person who would walk into the temple and see priests lighting incense or seeing some kind of a sacrifice. I mean, the temple worship was very different. And yet the underlying precepts, the underlying concepts are there. And as you go through chapter 29 of 2 Chronicles, what you see first is that the temple is refurbished. It is treated as something special. Maybe refurbish isn't a great word. Sounds like an old pair of shoes or a suit. What's really going on here is that Hezekiah decides that the temple has been neglected, and he fixes it up as perfectly as he can. And if you go through and look at all the details, he doesn't try to just make it look nice and modern. He tries to do it to the exact standards that he sees from approximately 350 years earlier, from when it was first built. He's not trying to make something new, he's trying to make something exact in the way that it was originally made. And he goes on and rededicates the temple, starting in about verse 18 of chapter 29. And if you look at that and try to find the words of rededication that are something that we would hear at a temple dedication or rededication, you will also look in vain, because it's not quite there, at least in the details, but the underlying concepts are there. The people come, just like they do in an LDS temple dedication, and their king comes. In this case, he's their religious ruler as well. And starting in about verse 29, and it's actually even a little bit earlier than that, after they have gone through all the sacrifice that we would not do, then you have something that looks very similar to what would happen at a temple dedication. King Hezekiah kneels and worships God, and the people do the same thing. And then chapter 29 ends with the phrase in verse 35, and so worship in the temple was begun again. And King Hezekiah and his people were happy, because God helped them to do all of these things in a very short time. That's the gist of it. And so we start off the lesson here with this young king who is dedicated to God, who focuses on the temple and makes its worship in the proper way, as proper a way as he possibly can. And it's not just for those around him. He invites everyone from the northern and the southern kingdoms to come and to worship in the temple. And Bruce, you had some thoughts, excuse me, about chapter 29 here, about John the Baptist and some other things that would be worthy of note here.
Well, first, I think it's good to look at this for Latter-day Saints when they read through this, and consider it as a type and shadow of other restorations the Lord has made, including the restorations in the last day with the reintroduction of our temple worship, the restoration of the endowment which we have, I was struck with his comments in verse 5 where he's telling the Levites to sanctify themselves. It echoes the words when John the Baptist conferred the Aaronic priesthood upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, talking about until the sons of Levi do offer again an offering unto the Lord in righteousness. A phrase which I've often pondered about, but the point is that you've got a restoration going on here. We sometimes lose sight of the sincerity with which restorations occur, and then how quickly things fall away after that. We're going to see that in some of the later chapters. I noted the Hebrew Study Bible notes that Hezekiah here is presented with parallels to David, Solomon, and even Moses. And as per Shon's earlier comments, that the focus here is on the temple. It's because of his dedication to the temple, cleaning it out. Temple's been shut up. Stuff has been dumped in there, including things that shouldn't be inside the temple. And it's like opening a boarded-up house, cleaning everything out, putting everything back in its place. There were some of the vessels that were necessary that had been gotten rid of, that were remade, re-sanctified, and it's creating sacred space inside the temple again. We don't have an exact parallel, but you can think of it a little bit like the rebuilding of the Nauvoo temple, which is actually razed to its foundation. But you have the same idea that an area that was once a dedicated temple no longer is given tremendous effort to make it a working, functioning, sanctified temple again, a house of the Lord.
Absolutely.
Could I tag on something there, Martin?
Of course.
You were making me think, Bruce, of Jesus's cleansing of the temple and parallels there. And then it's not the same, but as you said, but in the modern day, I think back to President Hunter's clarion call. We need to be a more temple-centered people, and we weren't necessarily cleansing the building itself, but we were saying we've been maybe missing this a little bit. Recenter ourselves on the doctrine of the temple that is centered on Christ, and so you just sort of made me think of those very modern, both New Testament and then modern day connections. So,
thank you. A couple of other thoughts in chapter 29 very quickly here. One is the fascinating comment that this was done in a very short period of time. That's mentioned towards the very end, and also in a few other verses. Where work was done in a short time period. And then you have this fascinating phrase in verse 15 that says essentially that King Hezekiah here is commanding the people to do what the law of the Lord said. Now, some translations of this are a little bit more akin to the way Latter-day Saints would see current revelation. I found this great translation from the, what translation am I looking at? I should know that. This is actually the Good News Bible, which is not often known for its precise accuracy. But in this case, I really like the way it reads. It says, and this is verse 15, "Then they began to make the temple ritually clean, as the king, who was acting at the Lord's command, had ordered them to do." And the gist of this is that this is not something where King Hezekiah perhaps just read some old book and found out how to do this. The implication from verse 15 here is that God is commanding him right now to act in certain ways, and the people are listening to what he says. One other quick aside here, people may read verse 16 and say, so why would they take all the things that are impure and toss them into the Kidron Valley. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? And the answer is that in sort of a reverse L shape outside of the city of Jerusalem, you find these two valleys. One's the Kidron Valley, and the other one is the Hinnom Valley. And those were sort of, for hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of years, sort of the trash heaps for the city. And they were also, in ancient times, the places where a human sacrifice by those who were worshiping false gods took place. And so the Kidron Valley, and in New Testament times, the Hinnom Valley, which Jesus refers to as Gehenna, that's his corollary to hell, those were bad places, and those were appropriate places to toss out bad things. And so that's why the Kidron Valley is the choice to toss out all these ritually impure things. Any other thoughts about chapter 29 before we move on to chapter 30?
And here's an actual lesson note. 31, where Hezekiah talks about the people coming and bringing sacrifices, and those who were of a free heart bringing burnt offerings, is a good call for our own generous temple service, that we need to do our temple service with a free or a generous heart, and not begrudgingly, and not waiting until we're assigned, or even just necessarily for the ward or stake temple night. And that gets back to the early comment from Shon about President Hunter's call for us as a people to renew our focus on the temple.
Thank you. In chapter 30, we find that the people prepare for Passover, and they do that in connection with temple celebrations, because those were both two very, very sacred things. One of the great verses in chapter 30 is verse 8. The King James says, "Now be ye not stiff-necked as your fathers were, but yield yourselves unto the Lord, and enter into his sanctuary, and serve the Lord." Once again, I'm going to read from the Good News Bible, which says it a little more directly, "Don't be stubborn, come to the temple." which is a little bit more direct. And I think we sometimes lose some of the directness in 400-year-old English from the King James Bible. If we just think of it in really stark terms, come on, people, let's not be stubborn. Let's go to the temple. Let's be good and do what we know we're supposed to be doing. I really like that particular verse.
You need to stick with the Good News Bible. I've got the Street Talk Bible on my shelf. I'll pull that one out next time. That one reads a little differently than what you're giving us. It's really fun, though.
No, yeah, it was headed by LL Cool J or one of those guys. Street Talk Bible. Right.
I've got it. It's fun.
I bet it would be great. I have not read that one. The Passover is celebrated in chapter 30, and again you have this reference to the Kidron Valley and about the human sacrifices and the horrible things that happened there, and that's where they toss the altars away. One of the most important things about chapter 30 is the idea at the end that after this celebration happens, that the people are filled with joy, and there is this terrific parallel, Bruce, that you had in connection with King Benjamin's speech that I hope you would be willing to share with us at this point, because I thought it was great.
It literally struck me not that I read Chronicles a lot, but it struck me for the first time going through this chapter that you've got a king trying to gather a divided people together. With King Benjamin, you had the Mulekites and the Nephites, and there was no real division among them. And King Hezekiah sends messengers up to the northern kingdom, inviting those in the kingdom of Israel to come down for this meeting. A lot of them reject it, but what you have is a fall festival at the temple, with the king providing instructions to all the people to reconsecrate themselves to God. King Benjamin goes a step farther and gives them the name of Christ, where with Hezekiah it's a rededication to the actual principles of the temple under the law of Moses. But it's a very similar situation, an attempt to unify a people at a lot of LDS scholars feel that King Benjamin's speech was probably given during one of the fall Jewish festivals. There's specific mention of those who come up to the temple for King Benjamin's sake, offering burnt offerings and sacrifices, and so it's parallel circumstances. It's a king trying to unify a diverse people and get them to reconsecrate themselves to God at the temple.
Martin,
Great comments.
you know, along with what Bruce, I'm sorry, I keep tag teaming off of it.
No, that's
sparking some thoughts here. So this Martin made a comment that's very true. Sometimes these Law of Moses temple ordinances seem so foreign to us. It's interesting what we see, though. Like, you took us to the Book of Mormon, and all of a sudden you say, well, this feels a little more familiar. And then I'll just make one last reference to what I was talking about. Even though I really don't know if such a thing as the Deuteronomistic history ever existed, one of the things that these non-LDS biblical scholars, many of them believe very strongly, is the temple ordinances shifted over time, and originally there was at this fall festival sequence, one of the really important things they did is they sort of reenacted out the creation of the world, the fall of the Adam, the beginning of them as a people. In order to prepare them to enter into covenants, the king was re-kinged, the temple was rededicated, Christ or Jehovah was welcomed in as the king and master of the temple and the king of the universe, in a similar way that the Nephites are, of course, going to welcome Christ in later. And all of a sudden, that starts to sound much more familiar to us, much more like the Book of Mormon, much more like the Book of Moses. And these are suggestions from, and not accepted by everyone, but suggestions by people who are not reading the Book of Mormon. You know, they're just saying, what can we understand of ancient Israelite worship? And I think there are some fascinating possibilities there.
Great thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead, Bruce. No, you're good. I was just going to move on to the next chapter. If you have some other things to add here, that's great.
Well, the only thing I was going to add is that, and I've made this comment in other roundtables, is that I think it's useful to use the Book of Mormon as an Old Testament check and balance, because we have a snapshot of a people who left Jerusalem around 600 BC,
Yes.
and we see both the stories that they recount and their practices give us at least a sense of at least what one faction was practicing at that time.
Yes.
And in an earlier roundtable, I pointed out the fact that members have problems with, for example, in Joshua, with the stories of wiping out entire cities. And I said, you never see that in the Book of Mormon. It's just the opposite. They're commanded not to go up against their enemies. I said it's probably useful to look at what's being represented in Joshua and say that doesn't sound like what the Lord was telling a branch of the house of Israel for 1,000 years in the New World. Therefore, that may not be an accurate story. Anyway, so that's for what that's worth. But yeah, the Book of Mormon is a great, if imperfect, mirror of some of the beliefs and practices.
Absolutely. And of course, the point that was made earlier is that the Bible is a wonderful book, and it has survived for millennia. I mean, the earliest parts of the Bible are more than 3,000 years old, and they have withstood the test of time because they were important to someone, important enough to keep in times when you couldn't just pull out a printing press and roll off 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or more copies of something. So these are stories that have withstood the test of time, even if they have been altered and changed a little bit. Another thing that struck me as a parallel to temple worship today in chapter 30 is in verse 19, where King Hezekiah offers a prayer and asks God to forgive those who are worshiping in the temple who aren't, forgive them of their sins, even if they aren't perfectly clean, which is a great reminder. People don't have to be absolutely perfect in every detail in their lives to attend the temple. You just have to be worthy enough.
Yeah.
And there are people who don't ever attend or don't attend often enough or as often as they should, because perhaps they don't feel completely worthy, and they may be setting the bar a little bit too high. If you can answer all the questions appropriately, and you are looking towards God to be a better person, that's the standard. It's not a standard of perfection. And so I really enjoy this this verse in chapter 30, verse 19, that has that same idea from King Hezekiah. Chapter 31, or else we're going to run out of time here. Hezekiah reforms religious life, not just the temple, not just the Passover. Tithes and offerings are brought into play here, and we have a rejuvenation, a restoration. Gosh, we like that concept, a restoration of religious life that actually happens here in chapter 31. Bruce, you also wanted to talk about parallels with the modern restoration. I don't want to steal your thunder there.
That's okay. And it was just a brief note. It's just a useful way of covering the material in 31. Is simply say, what parallels do we have here with our own restoration? I mean, you've got correcting of prior practices, and usually associated with that doctrine, reconstituting and reorganizing the priesthood, re-implementing practices such as what you mentioned, tithes and offerings. It's trying to get Israel back on track. It's not quite the same as a restoration after 1,500 plus years of apostasy, but it is a pattern that the Lord uses time and again, both in the Old Testament and in the Book of Mormon, where He intervenes and basically restores practices and principles, and in some cases, apparently, priesthood authority that may have not been there before.
Thank you. Chapter 32. Chapter 32 starts with a threat from Syria. And the emperor of Syria invades Judah and has a siege on several of the fortified cities that are part of Israel. And this is an often overlooked part of what King Hezekiah did, because we focus, as we frankly do in this lesson, mostly on his temple work and on his Passover and religious reformations here. But before you can have great religious worship, you need to have some kind of fundamental peace and safety in society. In chapter 32, a little bit as an afterthought, but still in a very important way, talks about what King Hezekiah did. He built a great wall that was over 10 feet tall and in some places 20 feet thick to fortify the city, and he had his workers hew through solid rock in many places a tunnel from some springs that were outside the city of Jerusalem to divert water into what is now called the Siloam Pool, which is a location inside of the city, water from springs, so that they weren't available to invading armies outside of the city, and they were available to people inside of the city. And in that way, we will learn in chapter 32, at least those who read it carefully will find out that in verses 3 and 4, and then again in verse 30, he has this great project that allows the city of Jerusalem to be safe. And so he does some great things there. And we also have some other references in chapter 32 here to Isaiah in verse 20 and some miraculous events. Bruce, you had some comments about...
I had one brief comment, which is just, it's very interesting to have Sennacherib, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
We all hope you're not, because he was trying to dishearten and divide Israel. So
yes. Anyway, it's actually reminiscent of some of the epistles that are sent by the opposition in the Book of Mormon, basically sending a letter to Israel and saying, "Do you really think your king's going to save you? You think your city's going to save you?" And from a more general point of view, I think we as members of the church need to be resistant to efforts by those who seek to divide and dishearten us within the church. And Hezekiah takes the proper approach. He basically says, "No, by golly, we're going to resist you, and we're going to put our trust in the Lord," and the Lord does, in fact, deliver them.
The Lord does deliver them, and in quite a dramatic way. The first reference that he made there was to verse 10, where the emperor of Syria, who's with his armies here, asks the people, how can you place your faith in your king? Because he's going to let you die. You're going to die of hunger and you're going to die of thirst. But of course they remain faithful to King Hezekiah. And then in verse 20, King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah pray to God, which places King Hezekiah in great company here. And in verse 21, the Lord sends an angel that kills the soldiers and officers of the Syrian army that are there. And so this king of Syria, who had conquered so many other armies and cities, is disgraced, goes home, and is killed by his own son. So things don't work out so well for him.
Martin, I'd love to say a few words about this chapter, if I could.
Please.
So this moment for Isaiah, if you read in the book of Isaiah, he refers to this over and over and over again. This is his moment where there is no way that the Jews should win, that Judah should win, the Israelites should win. The Assyrians are the terror of the ancient world. They cut out tongues. They burn people. They just shave people and march them naked, deport them into other cities. You've got some great non-biblical support for this. In Nineveh, when it was uncovered, they found what's called the Taylor Prism. And let me just read this, the way Sennacherib terms this, because Hezekiah, so this is quoting Sennacherib, it was found in Nineveh, because Hezekiah, king of Judah, would not submit to my yoke, I came up against him. And by force of arms and by the might of my power, I took 46 of his strong fenced cities. And of the smaller towns which are scattered about, I took and plundered a countless number. And then he says, I carried off all these people. And he's talking about all these incredible things he's done. And then he comes to Jerusalem and he says, and Hezekiah himself I shut up in Jerusalem, his capital city, like a bird in a cage, building towers around the city to hem him in, and raising banks of earth against the gate so as to prevent escape. And then the story ends. He says, I hemmed him up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, which is accurate. He never says he defeats Jerusalem because he doesn't. No one defeats Assyria. There's no way. And this is what Rabshakeh, the servant of Sennacherib, and Sennacherib, as Bruce was saying, say here. What makes you think? What is the evidence of your natural eyes that makes you think you can win here? You will lose. Everyone loses against us. Your God won't protect you any better than any of the other gods did. And to Bruce's point, here are Latter-day Saints thinking, boy, you know, religions are falling right and left. What, you know, are we? Who are we? Do we have God's power or do we not have God's power? And Hezekiah takes a stand and says, absolutely not. Now, it's interesting, and I'm sorry I'm sort of going on with this one, but this is one of the, I think, powerful stories of the Old Testament. When Hezekiah first gets this letter and this message, he mourns. He tears his cloak and covers himself in sackcloth. The first place he goes straight to the temple, and he sends his servant, he says, go get Isaiah. And then he prays this beautiful prayer to the Lord. So it's him seeking after the Lord in the temple. Guess where the answer comes from? Isaiah is the prophet. So he has a problem, he goes to the temple, and then another servant of the Lord actually comes and says, here's what the Lord says to you. Now, this is so LDS, right? I mean, this is so us. And again, for Isaiah, this becomes the great symbol that you can trust God. I mean, he prophesies, they're going to come. Are you going to trust in the Lord or not? And then they come, and because Hezekiah is there and points them towards the Lord and points them, says, trust in the prophet, they survive what no one else had survived. It's a huge victory. I mean, Sennacherib becomes a type of the adversary, a type of death and sin. There's no way we can overcome these things. But then we trust in the Lord, and through his power, we overcome that which is impossible to overcome. I love this story. So thanks. Sorry to go on sort of on that, but just a beautiful account, I think. Oh, wait, I got to say one more thing. And my favorite part of the whole thing, I think you got a great joke here. And whether you're in Isaiah 37, it reads the same in 1 Kings 19, is after the angel goes and slays everybody. The way it reads has always struck me as really funny. Let's see. Okay, I'm in Isaiah 37:36. Then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And then this phrase, and when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses, right? So they wake up, look down, oh, we're all dead. And
We're all dead.
story moves on. Which, of course, is the people in Jerusalem who wake up and see them. But the random personality that I have, that just has been a good moment. All right.
No, it's wonderful to see someone find humor in 2 Chronicles. That's a great thing.
There's inspiration there, and there's humor there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Gary Larson and 2 Chronicles. You know, it's
yes.
Anyway, this is fabulous, and thank you for telling that story so well. That added depth and a degree that most people would not find there. So thank you so very much for that. We have not too much time left here. I thought we were going to end early. We're sort of getting close to running out of time. Does anybody want to say anything before we sort of jump over to chapter 34 and talk about King Josiah before we run out of time?
Brief comment. We see the cycle of righteous and wicked kings alternating, which we see in the Book of Mormon, particularly among the Jaredites, and also with the Chronicle of the people of Zeniff, with Zeniff, then Noah, then Limhi. So you're getting the same thing here. You're getting Manasseh's wicked, but in Manasseh's case, he's led off to Babylon. Chronicles has him repenting and cleansing the temple. I think that Kings does not.
Right.
And then you've got Ammon. Good Egyptian name there. Ammon is also wicked. And then we get to Josiah, the great reformer. So now we're in 34.
Perfect. In chapter 34, we have King Josiah, who takes the throne very, very young. He's 8 years old when he becomes king. And as he is very young, he attacks what he perceives to be bad worshiping practices. And here we have perhaps an example of what's been alluded to earlier of reformation of the scriptures. Here we'd have a reference to the goddess Asherah and to other idols being smashed, the god Baal, or Baal, depending on how you pronounce it, and altars that are being misused. Now, interestingly enough, if you talk to some Latter-day Saint and other scholars, like perhaps William Deaver and Margaret Barker, who have a great affinity for Latter-day Saints, but who are not Latter-day Saints themselves, they will say, along with great Hebrew scholar who's now passed away, Raphael Patai, that Asherah was the wife of Jehovah, of Yahweh. And so you have this great parallel that we believe in a heavenly mother, and the ancient Jews, at least many of them, believed that their God had a wife. And yet here, Asherah does not fare well. She is not highly looked upon. And that may be because this is a reformation or rewriting or reworking of the scriptures that changes the underlying essence of it, so that the priests who were mentioned earlier, that the priestly group could retain more power, and the reverence that was going to Asherah would be diminished. So that's one of the thoughts. But the gist of chapter 34 also fits into the ideas that both Bruce and Shon have mentioned, and that is in verse 14, the book of the law of the Lord is discovered. And so in our narrative in this lesson, we have two reformations that take place. And this one is also very dramatic, although we won't have as much time to go through it. What happens is that King Josiah, starting in about verse 8, sends people to repair the temple. And how is it repaired? Well, money has been collected and turned over to the priests. And while the workers were being paid, verse 14 says that Hezekiah, who was the one taking care of this task, found the book of the law of the Lord. And it says specifically here that it was the law that God had given to Moses. So this is a very important work. And he gives it to Shaphan, who takes it to the king. The king hears it, and in verse 19, he rends his clothes. He tears his clothes, which is a sign of sadness. And he does that because apparently, as he reads this, he realized that they have not been worshiping correctly and not have been doing their temple worship as well accurately, which of course would be the case if they have to refurbish the temple. And so you also have this other very fascinating little aside where information is sought, consultation is made in verse 22 to a woman, a prophetess named Huldah, and she gives back information from God as to what God is going to do, which consists of a number of punishments that are going to overtake Israel because of its lack of worshiping properly. And then you have the great part of this chapter, which is in verse 29, where King Josiah summons all of the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, and he reads aloud to all of them the entire book. You know, think about, if you think a 15-minute talk in conference is long, he has them all sit down and he reads the entire book of the covenant which had been found in the temple. That would be a long general conference session. And
especially if it was anything like Deuteronomy.
that's right. That's right.
That's a long book to simply read silently.
There you go.
Sorry.
No, you're great. The upshot of all this is in verse 32 that everyone who was present promises to keep the covenant, and the people obey the requirements that are given to them and their ancestors, and so this is another time of great reformation. And then in chapter 35, excuse me, you have Josiah again celebrating the Passover with the people, and we come close to the end there. Other comments and thoughts here, gentlemen, before we bring our lesson to a close today?
I've got a couple. One is, of course, the finding of the scroll in the temple echoes the theme in LDS. I don't know if I want to call it theology or doctrine, but the idea that there are records that get hidden up to be brought forth in a later day in their purity to help spark Reformation. I mean, that's how the modern day restoration, pretty much got started. Was not with organizing the church; it was with the translation of the Book of Mormon. And there's actually a great article given at a BYU, or paper given at a BYU conference a few years ago, of how much the Book of Mormon actually influenced early church organizational practices. I'd have to go look it up. That just occurred to me. The other haunting thing here is that the message is not a good one, and this again echoes what we see time and again through the Book of Mormon. It's like, you people have been given the word, you haven't lived up to these covenants, you're going to be destroyed. But then he says, Josiah, because you're being righteous, I'll let you die first. But it's something of a depressing message, and it very much parallels what, of course, Isaiah is spending time, or has spent time previous to this, saying to Israel, you've broken the covenant. There are going to be consequences for this, and we're ticking down now, as was mentioned earlier, to a time not, Josiah dies roughly a decade before when the Book of Mormon picks up, which means Lehi was alive through the latter part of Josiah's reign. Lehi's message was not a new message, which the Book of Mormon makes clear, because it talks about Jeremiah and others preaching it. But he joins in the chorus saying, destruction's coming upon us because of how we have failed to honor our covenants with Jehovah. That's it.
Great comments.
Martin? Along those lines, it is, here we are sort of at one end of part of the biblical story strand, and you do, as Bruce was just saying, you see this in every book of Scripture except for the latter days. I heard somebody say you've got 3 different kinds of tales, and it's good for your children to understand this. One is a whole tale. That's where good is presented as good, evil is evil, and good wins in the end. Another one's called a broken tale, what we would say is a Shakespearean tragedy, where, again, good is presented as good, evil is presented as evil. Evil wins in the end, but lessons are learned, right? And then the third kind is a bent tale, where it's all mixed up and evil is presented as good and good is presented as evil. You get this in some forms of modern movies and tales and that kind of thing.
Hollywood.
Potentially so at times, yes. But fascinatingly to me, Old Testament, broken tale. Good is presented as good. Evil wins in the end for a time, but it's because people haven't been faithful to their covenants. New Testament, there's all these warnings, of apostasy is right on the verge. Broken tale. Book of Mormon, broken tale.
Right from the start, too.
Yeah. And the only whole tale that we have is the Doctrine and Covenants, modern day church history, because this is the conclusion of the story. The other stories are like Act 2 of a 3-act play, or Movie 2 of a trilogy, where you're left saying, oh no, nothing's going to succeed. Now we come to the conclusion of the story and we say everything is righted. And it's fascinating, even though this Old Testament story is depressing, we're so grateful to see this isn't the end of the story, that's part of God's plan, and an Act 3 is coming in the restoration of the gospel.
Fabulous. That brings us to the close of our roundtable today. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you will watch future roundtables and also find other things of interest for you on the Interpreter Foundation's website. Thanks to Bruce Webster and Professor Shon Hopkin for joining us today, and thank you all for watching. Join us again in the future.